I hike alone because people slow me down. That sounds harsh, but it is practical. Alone, I move at my own pace, stop when I want, think clearly. That trip was meant to be simple. A late summer overnight loop near Treeline in the Rockies, a place I knew well enough to feel calm, but not so well that I was bored. The forecast was clear. No storms, no cold fronts. I logged my route with a friend back home, left a note on my dashboard with dates and trailheads, packed light, but smart. I did everything right. The trailhead sat just under 9,000 feet, tucked into a broad valley of grass and lodgepole pine. The air was dry and sharp in the morning. The sun hadn't climbed high yet, and frost still clung to shaded ground. I set off early, breathing easy, legs strong. The trail climbed steadily, winding through trees, then breaking out into open slopes dotted with rock and low shrubs. Above me, the ridgeline cut a clean line against the sky. By late morning, I was near 11,000 feet. The trees thinned to twisted clusters and then fell away entirely. Treeline came abruptly, as it often does, giving way to tundra and stone. The world opened up. Wind brushed the grass. The sky felt close. I checked my altimeter out of habit. It read a little high. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice. I tapped it and kept going. That was when I saw the first cairn. It sat a few yards off the trail, a stack of flat stones balanced with care. It wasn't new. Lichen freckled the sides. It wasn't marked on any map I had. That alone wasn't strange. People stack rocks all the time, sometimes for fun, sometimes as wayfinding. I passed it and noticed my altimeter flicker, the numbers jumping before settling again. I frowned and adjusted the strap on my pack. The next cairn came 10 minutes later. Then another. Then another. They weren't random. They followed a loose line, roughly parallel to the trail but drifting higher toward broken ground and old talus fields. Each one was deliberate, stones chosen and placed with intention. They were too numerous to be casual, too weathered to be recent. Every time I passed one, my altimeter glitched again, jumping by 50 feet, then 100, then dropping back. I told myself it was pressure change, a temperature gradient, a cheap sensor reacting badly at altitude. Electronics do that. I kept my pace steady and drank water. The trail grew faint in places, braided by runoff and use. I stayed on the most worn line. The cairns kept appearing in my peripheral vision, drawing my uphill. I ignored them. By mid-afternoon, clouds began to build far off, nothing threatening, just white towers on the horizon. I reached the high point of the loop, a broad saddle scattered with rock. From there, the trail dropped gently toward a basin where I planned to camp. I took one last look at the cairns as they thinned out and then vanished entirely. My altimeter steadied. I felt a quiet relief I didn't question at the time. The basin sat at about 10,600 feet, sheltered by low ridges. A ribbon of water cut through it, clear and cold. I pitched my tent on a patch of dry ground, cooked a simple meal, and watched the light fade from the peaks. The air cooled fast. I crawled in my sleeping bag early, tired in a good way, muscles loose, mind calm. Sleep came quickly and then fractured. I dreamed of climbing, of stone under my hands, of balance and careful steps. The dream felt physical, my body engaged, breath controlled. I woke to darkness and cold that felt wrong. The ground under my feet was hard and uneven. Wind pressed against my skin. I realized I was standing. I was above my campsite, barefoot on cold stone. The pain in my feet cut through the last of sleep. I stood still, heart hammering, trying to understand what I was seeing. Below me, a faint glow marked the basin, my headlamp still on inside the tent, a small island of light. I looked down at my feet. They were dirty, scraped, toes numb. My hand shook. I had no memory of climbing there. No sense of time passing. I took stock slowly, forcing myself to breathe. The ledge I stood on was part of low outcrop, maybe 40 feet above camp. Not sheer, but steep enough to be dangerous in the dark. The rock was familiar in a way I couldn't place. I turned and saw a cairn a few steps away, its stones pale in the starlight. Fear rose then, sharp and clean. I crouched, feeling for balance, and began to pick my way down the slope, moving slowly, testing each step. The ground dropped away in short shelves and patches of scree. I focused on the feel of stone under my soles, the sound of my breath, the distance to the glow below. When I reached softer ground, my legs nearly gave out. I crawled the last few yards of the tent and fumbled inside. My boots sat where I'd left them. My socks were damp with sweat. My altimeter lay near my pack, its screen dark. I pulled my boots on with shaking hands and wrapped myself in a sleeping bag. Not sleeping, just waiting for dawn. Morning came clear and bright. I stepped out into crisp air and took stock again. My feet were cut and bruised. Nothing deep, but enough to make each step sting. Above camp, the outcrop stood quiet and ordinary. The cairn was there, just as I had seen it. In daylight, it looked old, weathered like the others. I packed up slowly, moving with care, and followed the trail down. The cairns appeared again as I climbed back toward the saddle, lining that same loose path uphill. This time I stopped and studied them. They weren't random markers. They traced an old route, one that cut across the modern trail and climbed toward higher ground. I recognized the pattern then, faint but familiar. Old survey markers, early mining or grazing routes, abandoned long before trails were formalized. The stones had been placed by people who moved by landmark and memory, not maps. At the saddle, my altimeter went wild again, numbers jumping and settling, then freezing entirely. I tapped it, then laughed out loud at the sound of it, thin and strange in the open air. The device had likely taken moisture overnight, the cold affecting the sensor. I turned it off and relied on my legs and eyes. By the time I reached the trailhead, my head hurt and my thoughts felt thick. I drove home carefully, stopping once to rest. That night, I slept deeply without dreams. The next day I felt worse. Nausea, headache, a lingering sense of disorientation. A doctor later called it mild altitude sickness, made worse by dehydration and exertion. He asked if I sleepwalk. I told him I used to, as a kid, during stressful times. I pieced it together slowly. The old cairns had drawn my attention without my realizing it. The altimeter glitches had fed a low-grade anxiety I ignored. At altitude, sleep can fracture, especially when the brain is tired and oxygen is thin. People get up, they move, they do familiar actions without memory. I had followed those old markers in my sleep, climbing a route my waking mind had noticed and cataloged without understanding. Nothing supernatural had happened. No missing time beyond what sleep can steal. No unseen force. Just a tired brain, thin air, and old human traces laid down on stone. The danger came from confidence, from assuming that doing everything right made me immune. I still hike alone. I still move fast. But I no longer ignore the quiet signs my body gives me. And I don't camp high without taking sleep seriously. The mountains don't need anything extra to be dangerous. They only require you to forget that you are human. I grew up hiking with my grandfather, so trails never scared me. He taught me how to read the ground, how to notice small changes, how to trust routine without getting lazy. We walked old logging roads, game trails, well-worn paths in state forests. He treated the woods like a workplace, not a mystery. That stayed with me. Even after he died, hiking felt normal, steady, something I understood. This trail should have been easy. It was well known, marked on every map, popular in summer. Early spring kept most people away, but that didn't bother me. I wanted quiet before moving abroad for work, a last familiar walk to clear my head. The forest sat in low hills, mixed pine and hardwood, the kind that smells sharp when snow starts to rot away. Patches of ice still clung to shaded ground. Meltwater ran across the trail in thin streams. The air was cold but soft, the sky pale and overcast. I parked at a signed lot, shouldered my pack, and started in without thinking twice. The trail was wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Old boot prints pressed into wet dirt. Everything felt ordinary. For the first hour, my mind stayed busy with practical things. Paperwork waiting overseas. The apartment I was leaving. My grandfather's voice in my head reminding me not to rush downhill. The forest made its usual sounds. Birds darted between branches. Somewhere far off, water moved over rocks. I passed a junction and stayed on the main path, exactly as planned. The first shrine stopped me because it didn't fit. It was nailed to a cedar about 20 feet off the trail, just visible through bare branches. A small wooden box, rough cut, no paint. Inside it sat fresh flowers, wilted at the edges, but clearly recent. Animal teeth were wired along the bottom, cleaned and white. Tucked behind them was a photograph, black and white. The face scratched until it was a blur of gouges. The bark around the nails was pale, the wood still raw. I stood there longer than I meant to, looking at details. The nails were new. The wire hadn't rusted yet. The flowers weren't wildflowers. They looked store-bought. This was an old folk art left to rot. Someone had been here recently, deliberately. My first thought was a memorial, something private placed just off a public trail. It felt wrong, but not dangerous. I stepped back onto the path and kept walking. 10 minutes later, I saw another one. This one was lower, nailed to a maple, simpler but similar. No photo this time, just a bundle of feathers tied with twine and another small cluster of teeth. I noticed then that both shrines faced away from the trail. If I had stayed on the path and not turned my head, I would have missed them. They were angled inward toward deeper forest. I felt a faint unease then, the kind that doesn't spike, just settles into your shoulders. I told myself people do strange things in the woods. Art projects, grief rituals. The trail was known and maintained. Rangers came through. There were signs posted about staying on marked paths. Nothing about this felt like an immediate threat. As I walked, I began to see them more often. Some were small, no bigger than a paperback book. Others were larger, built like shallow cabinets with hinged doors. All of them were fastened to trees just far enough off the trail to require intent to notice. All of them were recent. Fresh wood, clean cuts, no moss, no rot. They appeared every few hundred yards, sometimes closer together, sometimes spaced apart, as if marking something invisible between them. The contents varied. Bones arranged in careful lines. Pieces of antler, twine knotted in patterns that didn't look decorative. A few had photographs. All the faces were damaged, scratched, burned, or torn away. None of the shrines faced the trail. Every single one turned inward, angled toward the forest, as if addressing something that lived there. The forest itself hadn't changed, but my awareness of it had. I noticed how thick the undergrowth was beyond the trail, how the ground dipped and folded, hiding sight lines, how quiet it felt despite the birds. The path bent and climbed, then leveled out near a low ridge. Snow lingered there, patchy and gray. My boots left deep prints. I thought about turning back. The idea came clearly and stayed with me longer than I liked. Pride kept me moving. I didn't want to invent danger where there wasn't any. I had grown up around woods like this. I had slept in them. I had followed my grandfather off trails plenty of times. This was just unsettling, not threatening. Then I realized the shrines were increasing in number the deeper I went. The spacing tightened. Sometimes I could see two at once if I stepped off the trail and looked around. They formed a loose corridor, not guiding me, but lining something. The trail itself stayed normal, packed dirt and gravel, but everything just beyond it felt claimed. I stopped again and took a slow look around. No movement, no voices, no distant engines, just trees and wet ground. That was when the pattern finally settled in my mind. These weren't meant to be seen by hikers. They weren't warnings for people like me. They were facing inward toward the forest, as if meant to be read by someone or something moving through the trees, not along the path. That thought changed how I felt about every step. I began to imagine eyes between trunks, not because I believed anything supernatural lived there, but because I understood people did. People who didn't want to be found. People who marked territory. People who used symbols to speak to each other without words. I checked my watch. I had gone farther than planned. The trail map said there was a loop ahead, but I had no interest in finishing it anymore. I turned around. Walking back felt different. I noticed new shrines I hadn't seen before, now obvious from the opposite direction. Their orientation made sense now. From this angle, they faced me directly, open and blunt. Some were damaged, cracked, as if struck. A few had red stains that looked too dark to be paint. I didn't stop to examine them. The quiet thickened. The forest felt closed, heavy like damp fabric. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I felt watched in the way you feel when you realize you are the only moving thing in a place that should have more life. My pace quickened despite myself. Near the junction I had passed earlier, I saw something that finally pushed me past unease into fear. A shrine larger than the others stood deeper in the trees, almost hidden. It was built into the split of a trunk, reinforced with boards. Inside it hung a weathered hunting license, laminated, the name scraped away. Below it lay a broken trail camera, smashed clean through. That told me exactly what this was. This wasn't superstition. It was warning. Someone had been hunting here illegally, maybe trapping, maybe worse. Someone had been caught by locals or by others working the forest without permits. These shrines weren't prayers. They were markers. They faced inward because they were meant for people moving off trail, people who knew where to look. They marked boundaries, consequences. I didn't run, but I didn't slow down again. I stayed on the center of the trail and kept my eyes forward. The parking lot came into view through thinning trees, the gray shape of my car never looking so solid. When I reached it, I unlocked the door with shaking hands and sat inside longer than necessary, breathing. I reported what I'd seen to the Forest Service later that week. Once I had distance and perspective, they already knew. Not everything, but enough. There had been issues with poaching in that area. Organized, quiet, difficult to track. The shrines had started appearing as a way to communicate without drawing attention. A language meant to be understood by those already involved. They took my report seriously. They thanked me. They told me I did the right thing by leaving. I moved abroad 2 months later. I still hike when I can, but I think differently now. Trails are not just lines on a map. They cut through places people use for reasons that have nothing to do with recreation. What unsettled me most wasn't the bones or the scratched faces. It was how deliberate it all was. How calm. How clearly it said that the forest had rules I didn't know. And that day, for once, I had been smart enough to listen. I went hiking because my car broke down. That's the part people never believe, but it is the plain truth of it. I was driving alone through southern Utah on a two-lane highway that cut through red rock and scrub. The kind of road where you can go half an hour without seeing another vehicle. The radiator blew without warning. 1 second the temperature needle was steady, the next it climbed and steam rolled out from under the hood. I pulled onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The heat hit me when I stepped out, dry and sharp, the sun already high. There was no cell service. I waited with the hood up until the steam thinned, but the radiator was cracked clean through. I had water, some food, and a half tank of gas that no longer mattered. A brown trail sign stood a few hundred yards from the road where the asphalt bent around a low ridge. It marked a canyon trail. The ranger station was listed as 12 miles via trail. The sign was sun-bleached but intact. The arrow pointed into a narrow cut in the rock. It was past noon. The heat was heavy but manageable. I weighed my options and made the wrong choice because it seemed like the only choice. I locked the car, shouldered my small day pack, and walked toward the canyon. The air changed as soon as I stepped between the walls. The wind dropped away. Sound felt padded. The temperature fell a little, enough to notice. The trail followed a wash, hard-packed sand with patches of slick rock. The walls rose on either side, orange and brown, streaked with black desert varnish. The sky narrowed to a blue ribbon overhead. I settled into a steady pace, keeping my breathing slow, drinking small sips of water. The place felt empty in a way that pressed on the ears. My boots scuffed softly. My pack straps creaked. Everything else was still. The first hour passed without anything to mark it except the distance. The trail was clear and well used. I saw old tire tracks from maintenance vehicles where the wash widened, boot prints from hikers going both directions, the occasional candy wrapper lodged under a rock. I focused on keeping my steps even and my thoughts quiet. The canyon twisted and tightened. Sunlight slid down the walls and disappeared. Shadows pooled at the bends. About 2 hours in, I stopped to rest in a wider section where a dry cottonwood lay across the sand. I dropped my pack and sat on the log. That was when I noticed the prints. They were fresh, sharp-edged. They matched mine exactly. Same tread pattern. Same missing lug on the heel of the right boot, a flaw I'd had since last winter. The thing that made my stomach tighten was their position. They weren't ahead of me on the trail. They were beside my own, offset by a foot, like someone had been walking shoulder to shoulder with me. I stood and looked up and down the wash. There was no one. The canyon bent ahead and behind, blocking any long view. I told myself there was an explanation. People wore the same boots. The missing lug could be common damage. Maybe the sand shifted. Maybe I'd stepped twice. I shouldered my pack and walked on, paying attention to where I put my feet. The paired prints continued. Mine on the right, the others on the left. Always the same distance apart. They would vanish on slick rock and reappear on sand with the same clean impression. The longer it went on, the harder it was to ignore. I tried stepping off the trail, onto a slanted slab, then back down. When I returned to sand, two sets of prints appeared again, mine and the other, aligned, as if the person had stepped off the rock at the same time I had. I scanned the walls for ledges, for movement. The canyon absorbed everything. Even my breathing felt too loud. I kept going because stopping felt worse. The sun slid lower. The light thinned and turned gold. My water level dropped faster than I liked. The trail narrowed again. The walls leaned in. The air felt trapped. I told myself the ranger station was ahead. I imagined a building, shade, a radio. I checked my watch more than once, trying to measure progress without any landmarks. The first time I heard my name, it was faint. It came from deeper in the canyon, around a bend I hadn't reached yet. The sound lifted and fell with the rock, stretched thin. It could have been the wind catching on a crack. It could have been my mind pulling shapes out of noise. I stopped anyway. My heart beat hard enough to feel in my throat. I listened. Nothing followed. I walked on. It happened again near sunset. The canyon floor dipped and rose, and the walls flared, creating a bowl of stone. The light was low, slanting. My name echoed once, clearer this time, and then broke apart. There was no one in sight. I had not told anyone where I was going. I had not spoken my name out loud since the morning. The rational part of my brain reached for explanations and came up with nothing that fit easily. Sound traveled strangely in canyons. Someone could be ahead of me. Someone could have seen my car, read my registration, and guessed I would take the trail. The thought landed and stayed. I forced myself to move with purpose. I shortened my stride and watched the ground. The paired prints were still there. At one point they crossed mine, stepped over, then returned to their place at my side. That was when I noticed the scuff at the toe. My boots had a slight scrape on the left toe from a fall months ago. The other prints showed the same mark. Not similar, the same. The light drained out of the canyon fast. Shadows climbed the walls. The air cooled. I reached a junction marked by a cairn and another faded sign. The arrow for the ranger station pointed right into a narrower cut. The trail left the wash and climbed over rock. I hesitated and then followed it. The prints continued, appearing on the dusty ledges, always just to my left. I began to understand what was happening as my fear sharpened into something more focused. Someone had taken my boots, or someone had taken boots just like mine. Someone had followed me without staying on the trail, moving on rock where I couldn't see them, stepping down only where their prints would be noticed. The canyon made it easy. The walls bent sound. A voice could come from anywhere. A name could be learned from a glove compartment. I reached a point where the trail squeezed between two boulders and dropped back into sand. I stopped and turned slowly. I scanned the ledges above, the cracks, the shadows. Nothing moved. The prints beside mine ended there. Ahead, only my own continued. I did not wait. I moved fast, not running, careful with my footing. The trail climbed again and the canyon opened a little. I could see a faint light ahead that wasn't the sky, a pale square against the dark rock. The ranger station sat on a bench above the wash, a low building with solar panels and a metal roof. Relief hit me so hard my knees felt weak. I stepped into the open and heard movement behind me, the scrape of rock. I did not look back. I crossed the short distance to the building and pulled the door open. Inside, the air was cool. A radio crackled on a desk. I closed the door and slid the bolt. Through the small window, I saw a figure stand at the edge of the light and stop. He wore my boots. They were unmistakable. The missing lug, the scuffed toe. He did not try the door. He stood and then turned and walked back into the canyon, his steps soundless on the sand. The Rangers came after full dark. They found my car first. The glove compartment had been rifled. My boots were gone. They followed a second set of tracks from the road to the canyon, then lost them on rock. They told me later that a man had been living in the side canyons for months, stealing from broken down cars, avoiding the road. He had learned names from paperwork. He had learned how sound carried. He wore whatever fit. He walked where prints would be seen and stayed off the trail otherwise. The explanation did not make the memory easier to carry. I still see those prints when I think about it, set neatly beside my own, keeping pace in a place where sound dies and light leaves early. I was 26 when I took a week off work to section hike a quiet stretch of the Appalachian Trail in Western Virginia. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I needed space after my brother died in a motorcycle accident earlier that year. The noise of daily life felt sharp after that, like it scraped at me. I wanted long hours where nothing asked anything of me. I parked at a gravel forest road pull-off just before sunrise, signed the trail register with a stubby pencil tied to the post, and started north while the air still smelled wet and cold. The first miles went the way hiking always does. My pack rode a little high. My calves complained. The forest eased open as the sun climbed. The trail was narrow and clean, the kind that shows care from volunteers. White blazes sat where they should, spaced far enough to keep you moving, close enough to keep you honest. I fell into a steady pace, counting steps without meaning to. By mid-morning, I stopped counting. The trail did the work for me. I thought about my brother in flashes, his hands on the handlebars in old photos, the way his laugh used to carry across a room, the helmet he bought the month before he died, the one I had to pick up from the garage. Hiking helped because the thoughts didn't stick. They came and went with the terrain. By early afternoon, the woods shifted. It wasn't dramatic. The light went flat. The air felt held, like before a storm that never breaks. Sound thinned out. Birds stopped calling. Even the wind felt careful. I noticed it because my breathing started to feel loud, like I was intruding. I told myself that forests do that sometimes. Changes in elevation. A hollow that traps sound. I drank water and kept moving. The first pile of bones sat 10 feet off the trail on the downhill side, just past a bend. I almost missed it, white against leaves. I stopped because the shape didn't make sense. Deer ribs laid parallel, ends lined up, a spine segment set on top, vertebrae stacked like coins. No scatter, no null marks. Predators don't clean like that. I crouched without touching anything. The bones were sun-bleached, but not old enough to crumble. The smell was gone. Someone had handled them. I stood and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. The trail ahead dipped and rose again. I took a photo without stepping closer and walked on, telling myself it was a hunter's camp cleanup, someone with a strange sense of order. People do strange things. An hour later, I found another pile, then another, always just off the trail, always neat. Not every animal was the same size. A small skull sat between ribs once, set upright. The spacing felt deliberate, like markers. I stopped taking photos after the third one. I didn't like the idea of leaving proof of where I was. Around 4:30 p.m., I checked my GPS because the blazes felt farther apart. The track on my screen drifted left of the line I expected, then crossed it, then ran parallel. I stopped, zoomed out, zoomed in. The map showed the trail bending west. The ground bent east. I stood still and let the arrow settle. It pointed straight ahead. The white blaze on the tree in front of me was fresh, paint edges sharp. I hadn't left the path. I never bushwhacked. Still, the lines didn't agree. I assumed a reroute that my map hadn't caught. The Appalachian Trail changes. That's normal. I marked a waypoint and moved on, telling myself to trust the blazes over the screen. I reached a designated campsite before sunset. It sat in a shallow bowl with a spring nearby. The ground was packed dirt with old fire rings blackened by years. No tents, no trash. I set up quickly, keeping my movements tight. The woods felt close. When I filtered water, I did it fast and didn't wander. As dusk settled, the quiet thickened. It wasn't silence. It was control. Every sound felt placed. I ate without much appetite and crawled into my tent early. I kept my headlamp off. I lay on my back and listened. Something started moving after full dark. Not right away. I heard weight shift, then a slow step. Leaves pressed, then released. No snap. The steps kept a careful distance, circling. When it passed behind my head, I felt the space it took up, like a wall moving through air. The breathing came with it. Slow, deep. Each breath filled and emptied with patience. It didn't rush. It didn't cough. It didn't stumble. It made no other sound. I froze because moving felt like permission. My pulse thudded in my ears. I counted breaths to keep from shaking. The thing made a full circle, then another. It never brushed my tent. It never tested a guy line. It knew exactly where everything was. Hours went by like that. The forest held its breath with it. At some point, my fear slid into something colder. Patterns. That was what I clung to. The circle stayed wide. The pace stayed even. This was not an animal spooked by nylon and sweat. Bear's blunder. Deer bolt. This was practiced. I thought about the bones. About the blazes. About the GPS. Near dawn, the steps stopped. The breathing faded without retreat sounds. No footfalls away. Just absence. I didn't sleep. When gray light soaked through the fabric, I waited longer than I should have. Then I unzipped an inch and scanned. Nothing. I packed with care, keeping the tent between me and the trees as long as possible. I left without eating. The trail felt wrong in daylight too. The blazes led me across a ridge I didn't recognize. The map insisted I was somewhere else. After a mile, I found a blaze that looked different. The paint was thicker. The edge ran where bark should have been shaved, but it wasn't. Someone had painted over lichen. I stepped back and saw the angle. It pointed me toward a faint path, not the tread under my boots. I followed the real trail instead, ignoring the next blaze. The ground told the truth. Packed dirt, scuffed rocks. When I stayed with it, the woods eased a little. By late morning, I hit a junction with a side trail I recognized from the map. Relief washed through me hard enough to make my hands weak. I turned downhill toward a forest road listed as an exit. I moved fast and didn't stop. The road came into view around noon. Gravel, tire ruts. I stepped onto it and felt exposed, then safe in a way that made me lightheaded. I walked a mile before pickup passed. I raised a hand without thinking. It slowed, then stopped. I didn't approach. I stepped back and let it go. I didn't want help from anyone. At the next crossing, I found a trail register box. I opened it and read back a week. 2 entries mentioned odd bone piles. 1 mentioned blazes that led nowhere. The handwriting changed on the last page. It was heavier, pressed hard, all caps. It thanked hikers for respecting the trail and asked them to follow new markings for safety. No name, no date. I drove to a ranger station that afternoon. I gave a careful report without drama. Bones arranged, blazes placed off-route, a person moving around a campsite at night without making noise. The ranger listened and took notes. He didn't look surprised. He said there had been issues with someone living off-trail, someone who didn't want hikers near a certain hollow. Old reroutes, fake blazes, intimidation. They were working on it. I went home the next day. I didn't finish this section. Weeks later, the station emailed me to say they'd removed unauthorized markings and increased patrols. They said nothing about arrests. I still hike. I still trust my feet more than my screen. I think about my brother when the miles get long. What happened out there didn't need anything unreal to explain it. A person with time, knowledge, and a reason can bend a forest around themselves. The trail doesn't protect you from that. It only shows you where others have walked. There were 4 of us, all in our early 20s, carrying bad gear and more confidence than sense. We were college kids who thought rain was part of the experience and that warnings were written for other people. We parked along Highway 101 where the shoulder widened near a stand of alder and spruce, the ocean a gray presence somewhere beyond the trees. The trailhead was barely marked. It wasn't maintained anymore, just a narrow cut disappearing into wet forest. We were chasing rumors of an abandoned fire lookout, nothing more. Someone's cousin had mentioned it. Someone else had seen a picture online years earlier. That was enough for us. It had been raining for days. Not hard rain, just steady winter rain, the kind that seeps into everything. Low clouds pressed down through the canopy. Water dripped from moss in a constant soft patter. Our boots were already soaked before we'd gone a mile. The trail was mud and roots, slick and dark. Ferns leaned over the path, brushing our legs. The air smelled of rot and wet bark. It was cold, but not freezing, the kind of cold that works its way into your fingers and stays there. We moved fast at first, laughing, slipping, helping each other up when someone went down. The forest felt normal, loud with rain and wind in the upper branches. Birds flushed when we came through. Somewhere deeper in, water moved over rocks. It felt alive in a familiar way. We followed the trail as it climbed, then leveled, then dropped again, winding through second growth, and then older stand where the trunks thickened and the ground grew uneven. Around mid-afternoon, maybe close to 3, something shifted. There wasn't a moment where it happened, not a clear line. It was more like realizing a noise had stopped without knowing when. The rain kept falling, but everything else went quiet. No birds, no distant movement. Even the wind seemed to fade. It felt like someone had closed the door on sound. The silence pressed in, heavy and close, and it made my skin prickle. We slowed without meaning to. Our steps sounded loud. Mud sucked at our boots. The trail narrowed and became harder to follow. Blowdowns forced us to climb over or detour around. The ground churned into deep, dark muck where water pooled. That was where we saw the footprints. They were in a stretch of open mud between trees, a place where runoff had turned the trail into a shallow trench. At first I thought they were just distorted boot prints, smeared by rain. Then I looked closer. They were longer than any boot I'd seen, narrow at the heel and wide at the front, with a vague split shape that didn't quite look right. They pressed deep into the mud, deeper than our own prints, as if whatever made them weighed much more. The edges were sharp, not softened by rain yet. They crossed the trail at an angle and vanished in a thicker brush. We stood there longer than we should have, staring at the ground, comparing the prints to our boots. They were wrong. Too long. Too deep. Not clean enough to be a shoe. Not shaped like anything we recognized. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. The silence made it worse. It felt unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. We moved on because turning back felt like admitting fear, and none of us wanted to be the first to do that. The trail climbed again, steeper now, switchbacking through trees that grew closer together. Light dimmed as afternoon slid toward evening. The clouds sank lower, threading through branches. Visibility dropped. Everything was gray and green and brown, blurred by mist. We never found the lookout. The trail thinned and then disappeared into a tangle of brush and fallen timber. We pushed through anyway, convinced we were close. Our clothes were soaked through. Our hands were numb. When we finally stopped, it was because the light was failing and the forest ahead looked no different from the forest behind. We picked a small rise off what we thought had once been the trail and decided to camp. It was a bad spot, exposed and uneven, but we were tired and cold and stubborn. Setting up took longer than it should have. Our fingers fumbled with wet straps and poles. The rain eased to a drizzle, but water still dripped from the trees. The silence returned as the light faded, deeper now, heavier. I remember noticing how far sound carried when someone shifted their weight, how every small noise felt amplified. Dark came early under the canopy. We crawled into our tents, wearing damp clothes, listening to the forest. Sleep didn't come easily. The ground was hard. Cold crept up through the thin pads. My mind kept circling back to the footprints, replaying the shape of them, the depth, the direction they went. The scream came from the tree leans sometime after full dark. I don't know how long we'd been there when it happened. It tore through the silence and left my ears ringing. It wasn't an animal scream, not any I'd ever heard. It had rhythm to it, a rise and fall that felt deliberate, drawn out. It sounded like rage stretched across lungs not meant for speech. It went on longer than seemed possible, then cut off, then started again, closer. My body locked up. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I lay there, staring at the dark fabric inches from my face, counting breaths without meaning to. The sound moved along the edge of our clearing, circling, stopping, starting again. It wasn't random. There was pattern to it, a pacing that made my stomach twist. The rain had stopped completely. The silence between screams was absolute. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably less. Eventually it faded, the last echo swallowed by trees. The forest stayed quiet after too quiet. I didn't sleep. None of us did. When gray light finally seeped in, it felt like relief and dread at the same time. We packed fast in the morning, hands shaking, movements clumsy. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, but the silence lingered. We found the footprints again near camp, clearer now. In the light, the shape made more sense. They weren't human. They were distorted by injury. The split was uneven. One side dragged. The depth varied wildly. Whatever made them had been limping. On the hike out, the sound slowly returned. Birds flitted through branches. Wind stirred the canopy. The world felt alive again. We reached the highway by late morning, soaked, exhausted, quiet. Months later, after classes had started again and the memory had dulled around the edges, I read about a bull elk that had been struck by a vehicle near that stretch of road. It had survived with severe injuries to its chest and throat and disappeared into the forest. Rangers tracked it for a time, noting strange vocalizations reported by hikers, sounds that didn't match known calls. Injured lungs, a damaged airway, an animal in pain, moving on adrenaline and fear, calling out in a way its body no longer understood. The footprints fit when I thought about the weight, the depth, the uneven stride. The silence fit too. Animals go quiet when something large and unpredictable moves through. The rhythm of the scream fit the effort it must have taken to force air through ruined passages. That explanation settled into place and stayed there. It didn't make the memory harmless. It didn't make the sound less disturbing when I think about it, but it made it real. It put shape and weight to what we heard and saw. We weren't hunted by something unknown. We crossed paths with a wounded animal in a soaked forest, in bad weather, with bad gear at the wrong time. We walked into a place that wasn't meant for us and felt for a night what was like to be fragile inside it. I grew up hiking with my grandfather, so trails never scared me. He taught me how to read the ground, how to notice small changes, how to trust routine without getting lazy. We walked old logging roads, game trails, well-worn paths, in state forests. He treated the woods like a workplace, not a mystery. That stayed with me. Even after he died, hiking felt normal, steady, something I understood. This trail should have been easy. It was well known, marked on every map, popular in summer. Early spring kept most people away, but that didn't bother me. I wanted quiet before moving abroad for work, a last familiar walk to clear my head. The forest sat in low hills, mixed pine and hardwood, the kind that smells sharp when snow starts to rot away. Patches of ice still clung to shaded ground. Meltwater ran across the trail in thin streams. The air was cold but soft, the sky pale and overcast. I parked at a sign lot, shouldered my pack, and started in without thinking twice. The trail was wide enough for two people to walk side by side. Old boot prints pressed into wet dirt. Everything felt ordinary. For the first hour, my mind stayed busy with practical things. Paperwork waiting overseas. The apartment I was leaving. My grandfather's voice in my head reminding me not to rush downhill. The forest made its usual sounds. Birds darted between branches. Somewhere far off, water moved over rocks. I passed a junction and stayed on the main path, exactly as planned. The first shrine stopped me because it didn't fit. It was nailed to a cedar about 20 feet off the trail, just visible through bare branches. A small wooden box, rough cut, no paint. Inside it sat fresh flowers, wilted at the edges but clearly recent. Animal teeth were wired along the bottom, cleaned and white. Tucked behind them was a photograph, black and white, the face scratched until it was a blur of gouges. The bark around the nails was pale, the wood still raw. I stood there longer than I meant to, looking at details. The nails were new. The wire hadn't rusted yet. The flowers weren't wildflowers. They looked store-bought. This was an old folk art left to rot. Someone had been here recently, deliberately. My first thought was a memorial, something private placed just off a public trail. It felt wrong, but not dangerous. I stepped back onto the path and kept walking. 10 minutes later, I saw another one. This one was lower, nailed to a maple, simpler but similar. No photo this time, just a bundle of feathers tied with twine and another small cluster of teeth. I noticed then that both shrines faced away from the trail. If I had stayed on the path and not turned my head, I would have missed them. They were angled inward toward deeper forest. I felt a faint unease then, the kind that doesn't spike, just settles into your shoulders. I told myself people do strange things in the woods. Art projects, grief rituals. The trail was known and maintained. Rangers came through. There were signs posted about staying on marked paths. Nothing about this felt like an immediate threat. As I walked, I began to see them more often. Some were small, no bigger than a paperback book. Others were larger, built like shallow cabinets with hinged doors. All of them were fastened to trees, just far enough off the trail to require intent to notice. All of them were recent. Fresh wood, clean cuts, no moss, no rot. They appeared every few hundred yards, sometimes closer together, sometimes spaced apart as if marking something invisible between them. The contents varied, bones arranged in careful lines, pieces of antler, twine knotted in patterns that didn't look decorative. A few had photographs. All the faces were damaged, scratched, burned, or torn away. None of the shrines faced the trail. Every single one turned inward, angled toward the forest as if addressing something that lived there. The forest itself hadn't changed, but my awareness of it had. I noticed how thick the undergrowth was beyond the trail, how the ground dipped and folded, hiding sight lines, how quiet it felt despite the birds. The path bent and climbed, then leveled out near a low ridge. Snow lingered there, patchy and gray. My boots left e-prints. I thought about turning back. The idea came clearly and stayed with me longer than I liked. Pride kept me moving. I didn't want to invent danger where there wasn't any. I had grown up around woods like this. I had slept in them. I had followed my grandfather off trails plenty of times. This was just unsettling, not threatening. Then I realized the shrines were increasing in number the deeper I went. The spacing tightened. Sometimes I could see two at once if I stepped off the trail and looked around. They formed a loose corridor, not guiding me, but lining something. The trail itself stayed normal, packed dirt and gravel, but everything just beyond it felt claimed. I stopped again and took a slow look around. No movement, no voices, no distant engines, just trees and wet ground. That was when the pattern finally settled in my mind. These weren't meant to be seen by hikers. They weren't warnings for people like me. They were facing inward toward the forest, as if meant to be read by someone or something moving through the trees, not along the path. That thought changed how I felt about every step. I began to imagine eyes between trunks, not because I believed anything supernatural lived there, but because I understood people did. People who didn't want to be found. People who marked territory. People who used symbols to speak to each other without words. I checked my watch. I had gone farther than planned. The trail map said there was a loop ahead, but I had no interest in finishing it anymore. I turned around. Walking back felt different. I noticed new shrines I hadn't seen before, now obvious from the opposite direction. Their orientation made sense now. From this angle, they faced me directly, open and blunt. Some were damaged, cracked as if struck. A few had red stains that looked too dark to be paint. I didn't stop to examine them. The quiet thickened. The forest felt closed, heavy like damp fabric. I didn't hear footsteps behind me, but I felt watched in the way you feel when you realize you are the only moving thing in a place that should have more life. My pace quickened despite myself. Near the junction I passed earlier, I saw something that finally pushed me past unease into fear. A shrine larger than the others stood deeper in the trees, almost hidden. It was built into the split of a trunk, reinforced with boards. Inside it hung a weathered hunting license, laminated, the name scraped away. Below it lay a broken trail camera, smashed clean through. That told me exactly what this was. This wasn't superstition. It was warning. Someone had been hunting here illegally, maybe trapping, maybe worse. Someone had been caught by locals, or by others working the forest without permits. These shrines weren't prayers. They were markers. They faced inward because they were meant for people moving off trail, people who knew where to look. They marked boundaries, consequences. I didn't run, but I didn't slow down again. I stayed on the center of the trail and kept my eyes forward. The parking lot came into view through thinning trees, the gray shape of my car never looking so solid. When I reached it, I unlocked the door with shaking hands and sat inside longer than necessary, breathing. I reported what I'd seen to the Forest Service later that week. Once I had distance and perspective, they already knew. Not everything, but enough. There had been issues with poaching in that area. Organized, quiet, difficult to track. The shrines had started appearing as a way to communicate without drawing attention. A language meant to be understood by those already involved. They took my report seriously. They thanked me. They told me I did the right thing by leaving. I moved abroad 2 months later. I still hike when I can, but I think differently now. Trails are not just lines on a map. They cut through places people use for reasons that have nothing to do with recreation. What unsettled me most wasn't the bones or the scratch faces. It was how deliberate it all was. How calm. How clearly it said that the forest had rules I didn't know, and that day, for once, I had been smart enough to listen. I went hiking after work because I couldn't sleep anymore. Insomnia had been dragging on for weeks, the kind that leave you hollow by late afternoon and wired at night. I needed movement, a clean edge to the day. The hills were close to the city, a patch of preserved land wrapped by neighborhoods and cell towers. During the day, they were crowded with dog walkers and runners. At night, they emptied fast. I had done the loop many times before sunset and never felt uneasy. I parked at the lower lot at 6:40 p.m. The sky still held light, washed pale blue with thin clouds drifting east. I locked the car, checked my headlamp, and started up the gravel path without thinking much about it. The plan was simple. A quick loop, steady pace, back before full dark. The trail was wide and dry, dust rising with each step. City noise faded as the path climbed. By the time I reached the first switchback, the traffic hum had thinned to a distant layer. The first thing I noticed was the trash. It wasn't scattered the way it usually was. Empty cans were lined along the edge of the trail, evenly spaced, labels facing outward. Food wrappers had been folded flat and tucked between rocks like bookmarks. It looked deliberate, not careless. I told myself someone had too much time and a strange sense of order. It still unsettled me. Litter usually reads as neglect. This felt like arrangement. I kept moving. The light dropped faster than expected, the hills blocking the horizon. Shadows pooled in the low spots. I passed a trail marker nailed to a post, the arrow pointing left toward the loop's second half. I registered it without stopping. 10 minutes later, after a shallow descent and a narrow crossing, I passed another marker pointing the same way. That was normal. Halfway through the loop, my phone buzzed once and then went silent. No signal. That wasn't unusual in the lower sections, but I still checked it, thumb hovering, screen dimming. I slid it back into my pocket and focused on the trail. The air felt heavier, still. Even the insects had quieted. I reached a fork I knew well. Left continued the loop. Right dropped steeply toward a service road. I slowed, scanning for the marker. It was there, but something was wrong. The arrow pointed right. I stood there longer than I meant to, replaying the map in my head. This marker had never pointed that way. I stepped closer and saw fresh scuffs on the wood, the nail heads bright where the sign had been pried loose and turned. The thought landed fully formed and unwelcome. Someone had been here after I passed through. I turned back the way I came, heart rate ticking up despite the calm of my movements. I passed the previous marker. It, too, had been turned. The arrow now pointed downhill, away from the loop. I checked the ground and saw fresh footprints crossing my own, the tread clear in the dust. They were larger than mine, deeper. Whoever had not rushed. The steps were even measured. I did not run. Running would make noise and waste energy. I kept a steady pace, listening. The trail felt different now, narrower, the brush closer. I noticed more trash, more arrangement. A row of bottle caps pressed into the dirt. A broken plastic fork set upright between stones. The care behind it made my skin tighten. This wasn't random. It was marking. The light failed completely as I climbed back toward the ridge. I switched on my headlamp, the beam cutting a pale tunnel ahead. Every reflective surface flashed back. My breathing sounded loud in my ears. I kept scanning behind me, sweeping the light in short arcs. I never saw anyone, but the sense of presence stayed close, like pressure against my back. When I reached the final descent toward the parking lot, relief surged too early. The trail opened, trees thinning, the ground leveling. I could see the faint glow of streetlights through the branches. I lengthened my stride. My phone buzzed again as signal returned, a handful of notifications stacking at once. I didn't stop to read them. The lot was empty except for my car. The light poles cast long shadows across the asphalt. I slowed and scanned before stepping out of the trees. That was when I saw the footprints. Fresh, pressed into the dust around my car. They circled at once, close to the doors, then again wider like someone pacing. The tread matched the ones on the trail. I stood at the edge of the lot, light fixed on the ground, and forced myself to think. The prints were not rushed. They did not approach the trunk or the hood. They traced the perimeter, then led back toward the trailhead sign and disappeared into the brush. Whoever had been here while I was still out there. They had time. I moved fast then, keys already in hand, scanning every angle. I unlocked the car, got in, locked it again. My hands shook as I started the engine. The headlights swept the lot, caught nothing. I pulled out without hesitation and drove until the hills fell away behind me and the streets filled with other cars. I reported it the next morning. Park services took notes, nodded in the careful way of people who have heard too much. A ranger called me later that week. There had been other reports. Trail markers turned, trash arranged. A man had been spotted months earlier, living rough in the ravines, avoiding shelters, targeting evening hikers. He had never approached anyone directly. He watched, interfered, redirected. The goal wasn't theft. It was control, making people feel lost without touching them. They found him after a separate incident, sleeping in a culvert with maps and tools. Nails, wire, small pry bar. He admitted to moving markers, said it made the trails quieter. He liked knowing where people were without being seen. I don't hike there at night anymore. I still walk after work, but I stay where the lights reach and the noise never fully drops. When I can't sleep, I think about how close that felt, how careful it all was. Nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic. Just a person with time and intent, using a familiar place to bend someone else's sense of direction. That was enough. I was young, broke, and walking the Highlands because it was cheaper than hotels. October 1997, the kind of month that makes the land feel gray and sharp, the wind coming off the hills carrying rain and cold that seeps through even the thickest layers. I had a map, a compass, a small pack, and enough food for a week. That was all I could afford. I set off from a small train town in the morning, the air damp and heavy, the mist low, rolling along the ridges. Visibility dropped quickly. 1 minute I could see a stone wall or a stream. The next, everything merged into a blur of green and brown. The highlands were empty that time of year. I passed sheep, maybe a distant farm, but human contact was rare. That was part of the appeal. Solitude allows you to keep your pace and focus on the land. The wind pressed against my face, cold and persistent, and I welcomed it as a distraction from hunger and tiredness. The path was more suggestion than trail in some places, grassy strips between bogs, rocks slick from rain, boggy earth sinking slightly with each step. I had a sense of direction, but the mist made landmarks disappear as soon as I passed them. I trusted my compass, my memory, and my map. That was the only way to make it work. I had planned to stop at a bothy marked on the map. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing where it should have been. At first, I thought it had been removed. The stone walls were still there, moss-covered, leaning slightly, but the doorway was sealed shut with thick planks nailed from the outside. Someone had gone to the trouble to lock it. I kicked the wood with my boot, testing it, but it held firm. No windows, no gaps. Nothing I could do. The bothy had once been a shelter, a place for walkers, now inaccessible. I sat on a stone wall nearby and surveyed the area, cold wind biting through my jacket, fog rolling down the slopes. That's when I noticed them. Sticks, walking sticks carved from branches, planted upright in the soil around the clearing. Each had tally marks carved along its length. Dozens of them. Each stick stood in a neat row, dug into soft earth, leaning slightly into the wind. Some had been scored deeply, others faint, worn by time or rain. I counted at least 50 sticks. I stared at them long enough to feel the quiet expand. There was no sign of anyone nearby. No footprints leading to the bothy. The mist shifted and flowed across the hill, but nothing moved through it. The tally marks were deliberate, and the sheer number of sticks made the place feel heavier, as if the land itself had been measured and noted by someone else. I felt the cold seep into me, not just from the wind, but from the sense of observation, from the idea that I was walking into a place where someone had been long before me. I had no choice but to camp nearby. Night was coming quickly. I found a small patch of flat ground behind a low rise, sheltered partially by stones and sparse heather. I pitched my small tent, careful to stake it against the wind. The temperature dropped fast once the sun sank behind the hills. I ate cold food, nothing cooked, trying not to waste firewood I didn't have. Darkness fell, and the mist thickened, blurring the line between hill and sky. The silence was total, but not comfortable. The bothy sat just 100 yards away, a dark square in the fog, and the sticks leaned like silent witnesses. I woke at some point during the night to movement. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against the tent. The sound was soft but deliberate, like someone walking carefully over uneven ground. I froze and listened. There was again, slow, steady, deliberate, steps passing near the tent, circling in a pattern I could just sense in the fog beyond the fabric walls. Then I heard it more clearly. Counting, low, under the breath, rhythmic. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then pause, shuffle, another sequence. Each footfall measured, deliberate. I could hear the boots or shoes pressing into damp grass and soft soil. It circled the tent multiple times, the counting repeated, never-changing pace. I did not dare unzip the tent. I stayed still, heartbeat rising, listening. The sound stopped at intervals and returned. I counted in my head to measure it, trying to place the movement against what I knew of the clearing. Always outside, never too close, but never leaving entirely. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I stirred, I caught the soft scrape of a footstep on stone or moss. The faint numbers whispered just beyond the tent. I knew it wasn't a dream. The way the steps followed, the way the tallying coincided with the passage around my sleeping spot, was too structured for imagination. Whoever or whatever it was, it had learned the clearing, moved through it before I arrived. It was careful, patient, persistent. I stayed awake much of the night, head pressed to the fabric, listening for patterns in the counting, trying to understand how far they walked and what they wanted. Morning arrived wet and gray. The mist was thick, and the air smelled of rain-soaked peat. I crawled out, boots cold, stiff from the night. The sticks were still there, the bothy still sealed. I checked around the tent, the ground soft, slightly disturbed in places where I could see faint indentations, as if something had circled and retreated. Nothing approached me. No one waited. The tally marks on the sticks glimmered faintly with water. I packed quickly, moving with care, scanning for footprints, and began walking away from the clearing. Each step carried the echo of last night's movement, the numbers counting themselves in my head. I stuck to the ridges as much as possible, avoiding low ground near the bothy. The fog began to lift slowly as I descended. Visibility increased, and the hills appeared green and brown beneath me, familiar now in daylight. No one followed. I never saw anyone in the mist again. The bothy and the tally sticks receded behind me, indistinct shapes, strange artifacts in a quiet landscape. I walked until I reached the main path marked on the map, and then I moved quickly toward the nearest road, where I could find a bus or hitch a ride. The explanation I later formed was simple. Someone had used the bothy, carved the sticks, counted in the night. Perhaps a hermit, perhaps another walker, perhaps someone practicing some odd habit of measurement. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. It stayed with me. The care in movement, the counting, the silent pacing, it had left a mark on the place and on my memory. I did not return to that clearing, did not try to open the bothy, did not approach the sticks again. I still think of the tallying sometimes and the sound of careful, patient footsteps circling through fog and stone, counting each step as if the land itself was being measured and remembered.